Burning, a paranormal novella by Joan de la Haye. 1. The rite was ended. The moon hung on a black blanket of sky, peppered by hundreds of bright stars that were not visible in the city. The air felt electric against their skin, as the naked coven filed out of the sacred circle and congregated inside the warm farmhouse situated north of Pretoria. The coven was always more energized and more connected after a ritual. They believed these rituals made them more psychically connected and in tune with each other's minds and bodies. The sound of beating drums drifted across the fields from the shantytown located 2 farms away. Once they'd put their clothes back on, they would add the sounds of their own drumming circle to those of the townships. The full moon ritual had been conducted to attract wealth. They'd each empowered a 2-rand coin and tied a green piece of ribbon around it. The coin would be stored in their purses with all their other coins, but would never be given as legal tender. It was a relatively simple ritual, although one they'd never done before, and like most of their spells was unlikely to actually work. They'd each held the coin in their hands and chanted, the chant getting louder and louder until they were shouting it out, and their voices were hoarse. Their shouting had probably been heard by the inhabitants of the informal settlement. They were 13 women, a full coven. They were what some would call a Dianic coven. But they were, in truth, a bunch of kitchen witches who practiced most of their spellcraft on the stovetop. They had been practicing together for close on 3 years now, and there wasn't anything they didn't know about each other. They were so in tune with one another that their periods had synchronized. Over the years they'd seen each other through breakups, marriages, childbirth, extramarital affairs, and even a divorce or 2. They were a close-knit family that would do anything for each other, even kill or dispose of a body. But that particular bond had never actually been tested. As Marcie put the coin in her purse, she couldn't help but wonder if these small rituals were all there was to being a witch. There had to be more than just sympathetic magic. Tarot readings, candle spells, their monthly rituals, it all seemed so mundane. Dabbling had gotten tiresome. She wanted to feel the presence of great power. She wanted to experience the real thing. She'd had glimpses of it over the years. You couldn't have a dinner party with a coven of witches without a ghost or 2 showing up and having their translucent figures floating around the room trying to communicate. At first it used an Ouija board, but then after a rather strange event involving a previous tenant of the farmhouse, they'd discovered they no longer needed the board. Sandra was a medium, the real deal. She'd been talking to what she'd always thought of as imaginary friends since her 6th birthday, soon after her grandmother died. Shortly after Sandra joined the coven, Raven, the high priestess, informed her somewhat ceremoniously that she had the gift. Raven also told Marcie that she had the gift of prophecy and healing. Marcie wasn't entirely sure how accurate Raven's declarations were, because, if she was totally honest, she'd never felt prophetic. Even her tarot readings were a little iffy at the best of times. She had difficulty telling when her own relationships were ending, and she'd had a lot of relationships come to very surprising, at least to her, endings. She could never see the warning signs that everybody else could, long before the inevitable breakup scene. Most women were supposed to have some form of intuition, that's why they called it feminine intuition, but Marcie didn't even have that. All she had were weird dreams, which she didn't remember the next morning. The healing thing, on the other hand, was something she could buy into. She was an ER nurse at Steve Biko Hospital, after all. Having Raven tell her that she had gifts, that she was special, even when there was no evidence to back it up, somehow made her feel better about herself. When everything else in her life made her feel inadequate and small, the coven made her feel like she belonged, that she was special. You okay, Marcie? Taryn asked as she put a hand on Marcie's shoulder. Taryn was the empath in the group. You don't seem quite yourself. I'm fine. Just a little tired, Marcie said, pasting a half-hearted smile on her lips. Really? Taryn raised an eyebrow. Have you had a look through Raven's library lately? Marcie shook her head, confused by the question.
She's got some interesting new books. Well, actually, they're antiques, but she just got them, so I guess that makes them new. She smiled. Anyway, you might find what you're looking for there, Taryn said with a wink, and walked over to where the drumming circle started to form outside on the patio. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcie said to Taryn's back, but the seed of curiosity had been planted.
The library was down the unlit passage, through the kitchen and the archway on the left. It was a strange little room that seemed to have been added to the house on a whim by whoever had built it. It could have been a pantry in its former life, but Raven had decided to turn it into a library. Most people would find it strange to have a library off the kitchen, but it made perfect sense to the coven. The kitchen was where they brewed and cast most of their spells. The library was probably the smallest room in the house, but the most important one, as far as Marcie and the rest of the coven were concerned. The room had that musky smell that only comes from antique books. One wall was dedicated to ancient texts, some written in Latin and Old English. Unfortunately, Raven was the only one who could read them, thanks to her Catholic education. It was always a puzzle for Marcie, how a lot of lapsed Catholics found their way to paganism.
Perhaps it was the pageantry that could be found in both paths.
On another wall were more modern books by authors such as Carlos Castaneda, Silver Ravenwolf, D.J. Conway, Donald Michael Craig, and Scott Cunningham. There was even a copy of the Goetia translated by Samuel Liddell, with an introduction by Alistair Crowley in the older books section. Marcie's favorite one was Modern Magic, by Donald Michael Craig. The rituals within the pages had opened her up in ways she'd never imagined. She'd also ended up having a few interesting hallucinations, which had left her wondering if she'd gone completely off her rocker. Thankfully, Raven told her that she was now simply seeing things that most people were too close-minded to see. It had given her a taste of what was possible, but had also left her hungry for more knowledge, a deeper magical experience, and perhaps enough power for her spells to work.
Just once she'd like to see one of her spells come to fruition.
The books that Marcie was there to peruse were in a box in the middle of the room. Raven hadn't had a chance to unpack them yet. None of the coven members knew how Raven managed to get her hands on such rare books, but each one of them was worth a fortune. Raven had inherited some money when her husband died 5 years ago, before the coven had come together. None of them knew how much. They assumed that it was a considerable amount of cash. If Raven had inherited so much, Marcie couldn't understand why she chose to live on a dilapidated farm in the middle of nowhere.
The thought made Marcie shake her head as she fingered the spine of one of the books. If she'd inherited that much money, she'd probably have quit her job and bought a place right on the Cape Town beachfront.
The first book's leather cover was rough to the touch. She put the first book down on the floor next to the box, as she picked up the second volume. It was thicker and heavier and much older than the first.
It vibrated in her hands.
The shock of power that emanated from the book gave her a fright. She put the book down with respect and fear.
It was a book she would not be reading, ever.
She believed certain things should not be dabbled with, and whatever was inside those pages was definitely something she didn't want to tangle with. The third book was thinner and not quite as old. It too seemed to vibrate with power, but not at the same frequency.
It didn't scare her as much as the other one.
It piqued her curiosity. Sitting cross-legged in front of the box, Marcie paged through it, slowly devouring the pages with her eyes. The text was in Latin, but a previous owner had written the English translation under each line in cursive. The penmanship was beautiful and strong, but faded from years of gathering dust. It was written in classic, old-fashioned English. She could imagine the person who'd done the translation, living in Victorian England. The magic behind the words enticed her senses, and hinted at the power behind each syllable.
"You still alive in here?"
Raven asked as she popped her head around the door.
"I think so," Marcie said, still staring down at the open book in her lap. "Find something interesting?"
Raven walked into the room and looked over her shoulder.
"Do you mind if I borrow this?"
Marcie asked.
Of course you can.
Just remember to keep a diary of your experiences, and the rituals or spells you do.
I promise to let you know all about it. Good. Now come outside and get some food before it's all eaten.
Those girls are ravenous. With difficulty she tore herself away from the library and the treasures it held, the book firmly in her grasp. She'd be putting it to use before the night was over, she decided. 2. The drive back to Pretoria seemed to take an hour longer than the usual 40 minutes. Marcie didn't notice as she passed the turnoff for Ludwig's Roses, one of the biggest rose farms in the region, and one of her favorite places north of Pretoria. The book lying on the passenger seat occupied every corner of her mind. She couldn't wait to get it home and spend the rest of the weekend exploring every page, every spell and ritual. There was one in particular that had caught her eye during her cursory perusal in the library, a ritual involving the summoning of an incubus, a male sex demon.
She hadn't felt the touch of a man in over a year.
Her body ached to feel something sensual again. Marcie's relationships were not known to last. Her short-lived marriage to a control freak had ended badly 2 years ago, and her relationships had gone from bad to worse since then. She was on the verge of giving up on men, relationships and love, but the thought of giving up on having sex ever again was too depressing to contemplate. It was almost midnight when Marcie unlocked the front door to her apartment. The full moon shone through the kitchen window, illuminating her open-plan lounge, dining room and kitchen. It was here that she performed all her personal spells and rituals. After she'd closed and locked the front door, she pulled her witch box out of the bottom of her bedroom cupboard.
She hadn't quite come out of the broom closet.
If anyone at the hospital found out that she was a practicing witch, she'd get fired. Religious freedom was only paid lip service in the predominantly Dutch Reformed population. Hazel, a member of the coven, had been evicted from her flat and accused of devil worship when her landlord found out that she was a practicing witch. Since then all of them had been more careful. Taking a deep breath and exhaling slowly, she visualized all negativity leaving her body in a black cloud with her breath.
As she breathed in once more, she imagined positive energy entering her body. Marcie tried to focus on the spell and that it would be successful. She tried to ignore any nagging doubts.
She tried to believe that it would succeed, that this would be the spell that would prove that everything she believed was real.
She desperately needed it to work.
She read over the incubus ritual a few more times, and made sure she had all of the required ingredients. The circle was cast with her furbu, a Tibetan demon dagger usually used for healing rituals, in hand and then drawn in salt. She intoned the words and cut her finger. Drops of blood landed in her brass chalice on her makeshift altar, and then she presented her blood as an offering. The ritual was done. Marcie stood in the middle of the circle, waiting for something spectacular and mind-altering to happen.
But there was no otherworldly specter or lightning flash, no voice from the world beyond. Nothing happened.
She frowned as she took the circle down, swept up the salt, and made notes in her ritual diary. She couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. She'd followed the instructions to the letter. She wrote down the date, time, phase of the moon as well as her physical and emotional condition, and the step-by-step guide of the ritual. Under results she scribbled down, "Bloody thing didn't work. Why do I bother?
They never work for me. Maybe I should just give up." After she'd packed up the altar and swept up the salt, she closed her ritual diary and put it on top of the box, back in the cupboard.
She left the chalice on top of her coffee table that doubled as her altar. She didn't have the energy to wash her blood out. It could stand overnight, she decided, as she stripped down to her underwear and fell on her double bed. Exhaustion from the week's stress, coupled with the late night and disappointment, had drained her. She was asleep before her head touched the pillow. Marcie didn't notice the smoke drifting out of her chalice where her blood had coagulated.
She didn't see the form of a man in the shadows.
She didn't feel the dip in temperature or the goosebumps form on her skin. She didn't feel it when the apparition climbed onto the bed next to her. Only a moan escaped her lips as she was turned over onto her back.
There was a slight pressure on her chest as he touched her. It was his lips on hers that finally woke her.
The transparent face that greeted her when she opened her eyes came straight out of her fantasies.
It was the face she dreamed of every night.
Green eyes, black hair, chiseled features, and 24-hour stubble grazed her skin when he kissed her. Her mind struggled to grasp what was happening. Had she indeed summoned this man out of the ether? Had the spell in fact worked? His touch felt like a breeze from the open window as he caressed her bare skin. The underwear she'd fallen asleep in vanished into the dark corners of the room. Marcie gasped as his essence entered and filled her. It was sudden and unexpected, but completely thrilling. Every sinew in her body tingled from his touch. His essence explored every crevice of her body. By the time the dawn light filtered through her curtains, every part of her had been satiated, and her desires fulfilled. It was with a deep, penetrating disappointment that she watched him disappear as the light hit his diaphanous form.
She didn't want to be parted from him.
She felt a part of her tear away, which caused her physical pain as he disappeared. 3. Marcie woke to feel like a dwarf had taken a pickaxe to her brain. Her stomach wasn't faring much better.
If she hadn't known better, she would have thought she'd drunk a bottle of tequila all on her own.
It wouldn't have been the first time she and tequila had a misunderstanding. She stumbled to the bathroom, and only managed to get the toilet lid up in time for the chicken and salad she'd eaten the night before to make its way out of her body.
The sun was low in the sky, and in the process of setting.
Marcie had managed to sleep the day away, but was still exhausted. She flushed the toilet, washed the taste of regurgitated chicken out of her mouth and stumbled back to bed. The sun had long been gone when Marcie was woken by soft kisses on her neck and clavicle. An insistent hand between her thighs teased her. He felt more solid than the night before. His body had felt like a dream, as though he was made of smoke or wispy clouds. His tongue danced in her mouth, demanding her attention. Her hands explored his body and discovered that he surprisingly had form and substance and muscle and flesh. His lips tasted of salt water, and his scent was that of ocean waves crashing against rock. It was the smell of wild and untamed places.
It was a scent that filled her with passion.
She opened her eyes and stared into his green ones. There were mysteries in those eyes, which she wanted to uncover. She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her dream lover than just the pleasure he gave her, with every thrust.
And with every push came mind-numbing ecstasy.
All she could focus on was him, and the pleasure he gave her. Rational thought had no place in her bed when he was in it. The orgasms came hard and fast, one after the other. Her body convulsed with the overload of endorphins that went spiraling through her system. She'd heard some of the other women from the coven discussing their mind-blowing orgasms and tantric sex, but she'd never experienced it before. Marcie wasn't even sure she'd ever had a proper orgasm. She screamed as the last and most violent of them swept through her. She lay on her back, panting and sweating. Her demon knelt between her legs, grinning down at her.
"Can you speak?"
she asked between gasps for breath.
He simply nodded.
A self-satisfied grin plastered across his face.
"Will you speak to me?" She tried rephrasing the question. "What would you like me to say?"
His voice was husky, and sounded as though he were testing it out for the first time in centuries.
The sound of it shocked her. She hadn't expected him to actually speak.
Up until that point, a part of her had held on to the belief that it was all part of her over-active imagination.
That it had all just been a very vivid sex dream.
Instinct told her to recoil from him, to put a stop to it at once, but curiosity told her to keep going, to keep probing. Her curiosity won once again. In the recesses of her mind, she could hear her mother say, "Curiosity killed the cat." Her reply to that had always been, "Satisfaction brought it back."
And she was one very satisfied cat. "What are you?" she asked. I am whatever you want me to be, he said, edging closer to her.
His fingertips brushed against her tender and erect nipples.
Who are you? She asked. I am whoever you want me to be, he answered and ran his fingers through her tangled hair. Seriously? She frowned. You're honestly going to tell me that you're going to be whoever, and whatever I want you to be? Yes. Cool.
The endless possibilities ran riot in her mind.
Do I have to spell it out for you, or can you read my mind or something? I know what you want and need and will give it to you whenever you want or need it.
I will be everything for you.
And what do you get out of it? There's got to be a catch somewhere, she thought. You give me life and purpose.
Everything needs a purpose.
He sounded so sincere. Okay.
So,
what do I call you? I have many names, but you may call me Gregorathan. Can I call you Greg for short? As you wish. I do wish it, she said, her grin matching his. Now hold me. Yes, my lady. I could get used to this, she said with a smile as she lay back on the bed and felt him snuggle in behind her. Greg, just love me, okay? I just want to be loved. I'm tired of being alone. I will love and protect you.
I will never leave you, Greg said as he wrapped his strong muscular arms around her. She fell asleep nestled up against him, feeling safe with a man for the first time in years. The voice at the back of her mind, which sounded way too much like her mother, and that told her this was all too good to be true, was firmly told to shut up. 4. He was gone once again when the sun rose on Sunday morning. Another bout of nausea swarmed through her system. Her legs felt as though they would buckle under her weight as she wobbled to the bathroom. She fell to her knees in front of the toilet and dry heaved.
There wasn't anything left inside her stomach. If she wasn't careful, she'd end up in the hospital with severe dehydration.
She'd seen enough people end up in the emergency room because they hadn't been smart enough to take in fluids while they had stomach flu. Marcie and the other nurses had always thought those people were mentally challenged, but here she was making the same mistake. Using the back of her hand, she wiped a few drops of spittle from her lips, which were starting to crack from dehydration. She gulped the water down straight from the tap. Her dry, thick tongue reveled in the sensation of the cold water. She felt each nourishing drop seep into her deprived system. Water was the nectar of the gods, she decided. There must have been something wrong with the chicken she ate on Friday night. There was no other explanation for the way she felt.
If she didn't feel better by Monday morning, she would have to go to the clinic.
In the meantime, perhaps a cup of chamomile tea and a Valoid would help settle her stomach. The coven disagreed with her choice of conventional drugs over homeopathic remedies, but years of medical training had ingrained the use of mainstream medicines on her psyche. Herbs were all fine and dandy, but they took longer, and she desperately needed a quick fix which only regular drugs could give her. Her hands trembled as she filled the kettle with water. She had to concentrate extra hard to put a mug down on the kitchen counter without dropping it. While she waited for the kettle to boil, she slid down the wall and sat on the floor hugging her knees. Her stomach was bloated. She was too weak to stand, and cramps had a firm, debilitating squeeze on her intestines. Somewhere in her apartment, her cell phone rang, demanding her attention. Thankfully, she wasn't on call that weekend. She thought about getting up and answering it, but didn't have the energy to move. The water in the kettle bubbled. The button clicked, letting her know that the water had boiled. With the last of her strength, she hoisted herself to her feet. The kettle tapped against the rim of the mug as she poured the boiling water. Steam caressed her face. The relaxing scent of chamomile wafted up her nostrils. Her cell phone rang again, jarring her frayed nerves. She thought some more about taking the few paces she needed to answer it in time, but once again, couldn't quite get herself to take the first step. It stopped ringing. Whoever it was could leave a message. The hot chamomile tea flooded down her throat like a river overflowing its banks after a long dry season, and sloshed into her empty stomach. The Valoid tablets were tucked away at the back of the medicine cabinet. She popped one in her mouth and chased it down with another sip of tea, before sinking down to the floor again, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. She sipped the rest of the tea slowly, savoring each drop. With shaking hands she put the mug down on the cold tiled floor, still too weak to get up. The floor was as good a place as any to fall asleep.
The tiles felt cold against her hot cheeks.
Through half-closed eyes she watched as the sun moved across the room. Shadows grew long and then disappeared once again. The room grew dark, and the tiles she'd been lying on had absorbed her body heat and were no longer cool.
Her body was wet with sweat.
She barely noticed it when Greg picked her up and carried her to the bedroom. She floated through the air and landed on her bed. His lips were soft and gentle as he kissed her sweaty brow. Her cell phone rang once again from somewhere in the darkness. His caresses were gentle. His tongue and fingers seemed to be everywhere at once. When he kissed her, a flicker of life returned to her limbs. Hunger and thirst were replaced by lust. Her body, which had been so weak before, responded to his with a burst of energy she'd never known she was capable of, even at her healthiest. His tongue explored every crevice, sending fingers of ecstasy along every part of her body.
She tasted herself on his lips.
He penetrated her with a gentleness she'd never known from him or any other man.
It felt a lot like love as he breathed into her mouth and breathed life back into her soul. Then she exhaled, and he sucked her breath in.
He sucked it all in, emptying her of everything she'd ever known or felt. Dots of light appeared at the periphery of her vision, and the room spun. Her vision blurred, and her consciousness faded. 5. Bang. 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 The knocking came from the edge of consciousness. With each knock a semblance of her essence returned. It ebbed and flowed.
Her eyelids were heavy, and felt as though they'd been sewn together.
She had to fight to open them, and as they opened, it felt as though they were being ripped apart. A scream erupted from deep within her. Greg sat on the bed, naked and cross-legged, staring at her, fascinated by her screams. His self-satisfied grin firmly in place.
There was no sign of concern for her, just that damn grin.
She contemplated slapping it off his face, but that would have meant moving. It would probably have hurt her more than him. The sun teased its way through the gap in the closed curtains. The light burnt her bloodshot eyes. She wanted to shut them but was worried that if she did, she'd never open them again. Bang. Bang. Bang.
It took Marcie a few minutes to realize that the banging came from the front door, and not inside her head. "Marcie, open the goddamn door," Raven shouted. "Marcie, please just let us know that you're still alive. We heard you scream."
Bang. 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 The sheet was wrapped around her feet and tripped her as she stumbled out of bed.
The carpet slammed into the palms of her hands, her wrists absorbed the impact.
She thought about staying right where she'd landed, with her one foot still stuck on the mattress, and the other folded under her stomach, but then the banging wouldn't stop. She tried to shout out to let them know she was alive, but she couldn't get her throat and voice box to cooperate. Greg made no attempt to help her.
He sat on the bed, watching her struggle. He seemed fascinated by her plight.
More loud knocking on the door egged her on.
She had to get up, or she'd be lying there for the rest of time. If she didn't move, she'd be lost forever.
Marcie couldn't manage to stand, so she crawled to the door. Her will to live drove her forward. Her legs wobbled under her, as she used the couch and the coffee table to pull herself up. She only managed to unlock the door before collapsing once more. Thankfully it was enough. Raven and Sandra burst in, wands brandished.
Marcie would have laughed if she had the energy. They looked ridiculous. "Holy shit," Sandra whispered. "Oh my goddess," Raven said. "We're too late. We should have come the moment you didn't answer your phone. This is my fault. I knew something was wrong." "I'm fine," Marcie whispered through pale, dry, cracked lips. "It's just some nasty stomach flu." "It's not the stomach flu, Marcie," Raven said. "Have you looked at yourself?
Because you look like you're about 8 months pregnant.
Not possible, Marcie whispered with a shake of her head.
The movement sent bolts of lightning through her brain.
It may not be possible, but it's what it looks like, Sandra said as she knelt next to Marcie, picked up her limp hands and put them on her naked, swollen belly. Do you feel that?
Marcie couldn't comprehend what her hands were telling her.
It didn't compute. And then she felt something move under her skin. Something was moving inside her.
She tried to scream, but instead, only a guttural wail escaped from inside her.
She sounded like a wounded animal trying to escape a trap.
Greg stood naked in the bedroom doorway. He looked down at the three women like a child examining ants under a magnifying glass.
I'm going to be a father, he said.
6. The baby stirred inside her. Its little feet left footprints on the underside of her ever-expanding belly. With every passing minute, her stomach grew. Raven and Sandra hovered over her and gave the demon dirty looks. They kept their homemade wands pointed at him. The coven had all made their own wands a couple of years ago. Marcie had made hers from a willow tree branch she'd found while walking in the botanical gardens. Willow was supposed to be good for healing. She'd built her life around the healing profession, but now she couldn't even help herself. That old saying, "Physician, heal thyself," seemed to laugh at her. She couldn't help but wonder if those wands would actually work. Would they be able to defend themselves against a demon with only their wands for protection?
Somehow she didn't think so.
The wands held no power, they were just sticks they'd made to look pretty. She had a feeling that if Greg really wanted to, he could have killed them all with a single flick of his little finger. That thought sent her exhausted brain spiraling into all sorts of dark and scary places. With each avenue that her brain pursued, she kept coming to one conclusion. It all had to be some sort of nightmare.
It couldn't possibly be real.
She tried pinching herself, but only ended up with a red welt on her pale arm. She thought about slapping herself, but then she looked at the welt and realized it was futile.
It wasn't a bad dream. This was her seriously screwed up reality.
Raven brought her another cup of chamomile tea, while Sandra brought her a robe to cover her naked body. She was sitting on her couch, but couldn't quite remember how she got there.
Sandra helped her get the robe on.
The simple movement of lifting an arm to put it inside a sleeve was exhausting her dwindling energy reserves. It was strange how covering herself with a simple piece of fabric made her feel less vulnerable, even if it was an illusion. Her muscles were fatigued, and all she wanted to do was curl up and fall asleep, but Raven and Sandra wouldn't give her a moment's peace. They kept forcing her to drink tea, and then eat a slice of toast with a thick layer of Marmite spread on it. She hated Marmite, and couldn't even remember ever buying it. The nausea subsided, and she managed to keep the tea and toast down. The baby kicked. She wondered if her placenta could be bruised by the kick. The kid was already a rugby player, and would soon be putting its foot through her womb.
We have to get her back to the farm, Raven said. We have to get her to our sacred space. The mother of my child goes nowhere without me, Greg declared and slammed the front door closed from across the room with a flick of his wrist. I don't care what you do, but if Marcie is to survive the birth of this child, she will have to give birth in our sacred circle with the coven in attendance.
You can come along or stay here.
I don't care. But Marcie is coming with us.
Raven stood up and faced him, her wand pointed at his chest.
I have never traveled by automobile, Greg said with a smile. It will be an interesting experience. You're not coming with us, Sandra said as she stood and brandished her wand. Raven, we can't let him come with us. We have to keep him away from Marcie and the child. You're right, Raven sighed. We have to protect them no matter what.
Greg laughed at their attempt at being superheroes. Marcie couldn't blame him for thinking them ridiculous.
They sounded as though they'd stepped out of a bad B-grade film.
They'd obviously watched a few too many Harry Potter movies, and forgot that they weren't actually Hermione.
Marcie and the child belong to me.
I go where they go.
There is nothing you can do to stop me.
Those little sticks you hold have no power. You have no power. The wands burst into flames. Sandra dropped hers to the floor, but Raven held on to hers, trying to prove him wrong, but only succeeded in getting her hand burnt. She could be a stubborn witch at the best of times.
Fine.
You win this round, but this isn't over, Raven said, nursing her wounded hand and pouting.
Excuse me, Marcie interrupted. I'm not sure how much time I have, so could we just call it quits on the pissing contest and get me to a hospital, or wherever you've decided to take me?
My vote, for what it's worth, would be for a hospital.
We can't take you to the hospital. There would be too many questions, and this is going to be an unnatural birth.
Marianne is a qualified midwife. You'll be in good hands, Sandra said, patting her on the shoulder. Another thing you need to take into consideration is that we don't know what the baby is going to look like when it comes out of you, Raven said, and then turned to Greg.
Since you're insisting on coming along, would you make yourself useful and carry her to the car?
Greg lifted her as though she weighed nothing more than the fetus growing inside her. He was still bare-ass naked, but nobody seemed to worry about it. Raven and Sandra followed closely behind him. Thankfully, none of her neighbors was around to see the spectacle. 7. Raven drove, while Sandra kept a nervous eye on Gregorathan. Marcie, half comatose, cuddled on Raven's Land Rover's back seat with the father of her child, to the consternation of the other two witches. She was too exhausted to be afraid of him.
It was a little late in the game for that.
She'd already let him into the most intimate depths of her soul. There was no going back from that. All that mattered now was coming out of it, with her baby alive. The demon's hand stroked Marcie's stomach. From previous experience, Marcie knew that Raven would ordinarily have had classical music such as Mozart tinkling through her speakers, but for this trip, she'd opted to put AC/DC's Highway to Hell on repeat. While Greg rubbed her belly with one hand, he stroked her brow with the other. A smile played on his lips as he watched the two women in the front seats, their concern and fear growing. Despite the music blaring through the speakers, Marcie drifted off into a deep, fitful sleep. She descended deeper into her dreams, her breathing quickened, and so did her pulse. A baby cried somewhere in the distance, in the fog and the dark. Naked witches chanted and danced in the moonlight. 4 tiki torches marked the cardinal points. Raven held Marcie's newborn baby, its umbilical cord dangling between its legs. A ceremonial dagger at the baby's throat. Greg circled them, unable to cross the barrier they directed. Marcie screamed. She couldn't move. She was frozen in place, on the altar. Blood seeped out from between her legs and soaked into the stone. The baby's cries stopped abruptly as Raven slit its throat like a lamb being slaughtered. Blood ran while Greg howled. Lanterns exploded. Flames kissed the naked flesh of dancing witches and then engulfed them. A scream erupted from Marcie's lips as her eyes popped open. She was back in the car but could still smell burning flesh.
Are you okay, Marcie?
Raven asked, looking at her through the rear view mirror.
It was just a bad dream, Marcie managed to squeak the words out. Sheesh, Sandra said with her hand to her chest. You gave me a frigging heart attack.
Don't do that.
I thought that bloody demon or his spawn were killing you.
Greg still caressed her brow and rubbed her belly. His only reply to Sandra's comment was that his smile turned to a snarl and curled his upper lip as he glared at the two witches. His fist clenched on her stomach.
It had just been a dream, she tried to convince herself.
The feeling that it had been a premonition tugged at her and wouldn't let her go.
But she couldn't or wouldn't believe that her friends would kill her baby, or any baby for that matter.
They weren't baby killers.
They couldn't be.
She didn't know who the real threat to her and her child was anymore. Was the baby's demon daddy the threat, or were her friends? Fear and confusion sent icy fingers through her body and gripped her heart.
Shush, Greg hushed her and then whispered in her ear. You must keep calm for our child's sake.
She needs serenity to grow stronger. She will sense the danger and come out too soon. She needs more time. We must give her more time. She must come out strong. Her existence depends on that. Do you understand? Marcie nodded and instantly regretted moving her head as pain throbbed from the base of her skull all the way through to her frontal lobe. She wondered if he knew what she'd just dreamt. The question sent her fragile mind spiraling into more dark avenues that resulted in even more disturbing questions. Were they really that connected, that he knew what she was dreaming and thinking?
It took her a few more seconds to grasp that he'd said that it was a girl. Marcie was going to have a daughter. She'd always wanted a little girl.
Conflicting emotions struggled within her. Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't know if they were tears of joy or sadness.
They're all on their way, Sandra said. They should all be there within the hour or so. Good.
The moon is now moving from full into its waning phase. Perfect for a banishing ritual.
A banishing ritual?
They want to use a simple banishing ritual on me. That is insulting. As if a simple ritual could get rid of anything as powerful as one such as me, Greg scoffed. His language skills were getting better with every passing moment.
Who said anything about a simple banishing ritual?
Raven said with a smile. Marcie got a glimpse of that book in Raven's library, the one that had scared her. The baby kicked inside her womb.
The ritual isn't for you, Marcie whispered as she wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach.
No matter who the father was, it was still her baby, and like any other mother she would protect her child with her life. 8. Shortly after the second toll gate, they took the Petronella turnoff and climbed off the highway. They were now deep in farm country. 5 minutes later they crossed railway tracks and hit a dirt road. The dirt roads in the area were all named after different types of snakes. Raven's farm was on a dirt track called Puffadder.
Not that it really mattered what the dirt roads were named, they didn't get any public services out here anyway. Nobody came to collect the rubbish.
Raven had to dispose of all her own waste or take it to the closest dump on her own. She also had her own generator for any of the electricity that didn't come from her solar power generator, and her water came from 2 boreholes and a water tank. Her post was delivered to a post box at the dilapidated post office, attached to the closest thing that passed as a shop, about 20 minutes away. Most of the farms in the area were completely self-sufficient and off the grid. Raven was a bit of a survivalist, as were most of her neighbors.
They all kept to themselves.
The farm across from her was where a known car theft ring ran their operations from. None of the farmers bothered the criminals, and the criminals left them alone for the most part. Only the odd calf or lamb went missing whenever the boys from the township went through their initiation rituals. Her farm workers knew that she was a witch, and for the most part were a superstitious lot who were afraid she'd hex them.
This amused her and the coven endlessly.
When they arrived, the sun hung low on the horizon, and the sky was an endless veil of pinks, oranges and reds. Judging by the number of cars parked in front of the farmhouse, most of the coven was already there and waiting to kill her child. Paranoia sent its icy tentacles through her sinews, making her even more jittery.
Calm yourself, the demon whispered in her ear as he helped her out of the car and carried her into the old house.
It was only when he carried her past the hallway mirror that she got a glimpse of herself. Her skin was ashen and her once lush dark brown hair was limp, oily and had streaks of grey that hadn't been there before. She'd aged at least 15 years over the last couple of days. Her belly looked about ready to explode.
Her protruding navel played peekaboo through her gown. She's almost ready, Greg said.
His voice had that proud daddy sound to it. Would she live long enough to have that same tone to her voice? And if she survived, would she only live to be afraid of her own child? Should she fight for her unborn child's life, or allow her friends to murder her daughter before she could do any harm? The last thought caused the baby to kick in revolt. Her daughter wanted to live. All creatures wanted to live. A drowning spider still clings to life and tries to swim to the surface, even when death is a certainty. A contraction gripped her stomach muscles. Sharp claws slashed her womb from the inside, or at least that was what it felt like. A scream reverberated off the walls as her water broke. Blood and amniotic fluid puddled on the floor around Greg's feet. Voices that sounded as though they came from another plane drifted down the passage from the kitchen. Raven and Sandra stood behind them, their backup wands that they'd made in preparation for a day like this pointed at Gregorathan's naked backside. Their eyes cemented to the puddle on the floor. Their faces were almost as white as Marcie's.
It took a few heartbeats before anybody lurched into action. "Move,"
Raven screeched. The demon looked at her as though he'd enjoy ripping her throat out just so he'd never have to hear the sound of her voice again.
"Where would you like me to move to?" he asked instead. "Down the passage, through the kitchen and out the back door."
"The circle is set up outside on the left-hand side." Raven directed him, using her wand to gesticulate. "Put her on the altar," she shouted at his back. He walked through the kitchen with 12 pairs of eyes taking in every inch of his naked body. Beneath the hostility was an undercurrent of sexual tension. None of them had seen a body as toned in real life. The only view of perfect male flesh they got to see was on television in the form of Ryan Gosling. Greg winked as he sauntered past. It was a convincing act he put on for their benefit, but Marcie knew better. He was just as afraid as she was. Fear came off him like the waves of nausea crashing over her. Her womb tensed as her unborn daughter added her own fears to the mix. 9. The sacred circle was surrounded by apple trees, and tiki torches marked the 4 cardinal points. The stone altar, which had the sign of the triple goddess carved on by one of the local artisans, was at the center of the circle. The altar was actually just a massive boulder with a flat top she'd found somewhere on her farm, and then had the workers transport it to their sacred space.
"Is it as it was in your vision?"
Greg asked her. Marcie only managed a weak nod, as another contraction threatened her consciousness.
"We haven't named her yet," Marcie said. "She should have a name before she arrives, and before they kill her. They will not succeed."
"I promise you this," Greg said, staring at the altar.
"Our child will live."
The rough surface of the altar snagged on Marcie's satin gown as he sat her down. She was in the exact position as in her nightmare. The memory of her vision or nightmare, and what was probably about to happen in the space where she'd worked spells and rituals with her friends over the last few years, made her want to run.
To get away from it all.
To forget any of it had ever happened. She wanted to hit the rewind button. She tried to jump off the altar, but Greg stopped her.
"No, this is where you must give birth. On this altar.
With these women in attendance."
"Why? This is where they kill her," she said. "Trust me," the demon said.
Putting her trust in a demon that knocked her up during a weekend fling would have been a ridiculous idea a few days ago, but now. She wanted to laugh but instead burst into tears. She'd always heard pregnant women complain about their emotions going haywire or how their hormones made them crazy, and now she could attest to the validity of their claims.
But she wondered if any of them had ever been an incubator for a fast-growing demon baby.
"Great. I'm Bella," she thought. Instead of a shimmery vampire, she had a sex demon, and even though she wasn't a teenager, she'd still wound up in the same stupid situation.
The whole thing was just ludicrous. As she thought about trying to make another run for it, a contraction ripped through her body.
She wanted to grip hold of something, but the rock was hard and hurt her hands, not to mention uncomfortable. Greg, reading her mind, gave her his hand to squeeze.
It wasn't his hand she wanted to squeeze, it was his neck.
She wanted to wring the life she'd given him out of existence.
But she needed him to stay alive.
She needed him to help protect their child. 10.
"We have to kill it," Raven said to the gathering coven in the kitchen.
Unaware that Marcie and Greg could hear them through the open window.
"We are Wiccans,"
We prance around naked under the full moon. We put flowers in our hair and chant. We do not kill babies, Sky said. Sky's parents had been hippies, and she was the homeopath in the group.
And somehow I don't think Daddy Dearest will be too happy if we kill his offspring.
Do you want to be the one to break it to him, that you're planning on stabbing his newborn demon spawn with one of our ceremonial daggers?
Oh yeah. That's going to go down well. And what about Marcie? What do you think her reaction to killing her baby will be? She's always wanted a child, Taryn chimed in. Okay, so I haven't thought it all out yet, but we can't allow that thing out into the world.
I don't think Marcie wants a Rosemary's Baby situation on her hands. Do you?
What about an exorcism?
Would that work in this situation? Helen, the tarot reader, asked. Do you know anybody who can conduct a proper exorcism, without seriously pissing off that fucking demon and killing Marcie as well? Kat, the goth who believed in vampires, asked.
What about that shaman that Sandra shagged at the last Beltane feast? He seemed to know his stuff and he lives close by, Helen said. Oh hell no, Sandra said. I'm not calling him. He turned into a stalker after that night.
I almost ended up in the divorce courts because of him.
It took a lot of lying and cajoling to get Frank to believe that the guy had made the whole night up. It's either him or a Catholic priest.
Your choice.
That's not much of a choice. She frowned. Fine, I'll call him. But you and Marcie owe me big time for this.
Don't let it be said that I didn't take one for the team. And if I end up in the divorce courts, you're paying the legal fees.
If we survive the night, I'll happily pay your legal fees, Raven said as Sandra called the shaman.
11. The coven surrounded the altar. The flames from the tiki torches flickered in the breeze. The circle had been cast and the quarters called. Ghosts began to gather at the edge of the circle. Sandra's shaman, with dreadlocks down his back, stood beside Raven, who held the ancient tome open at the requisite ritual. Marianne, the midwife, stood in front of Marcie, holding her knees apart. Greg stood next to the altar holding Marcie's hand, while another contraction wrenched her insides. A scream erupted from her core.
It was all wrong. This was not how her vision had looked.
The shaman had not been there, and Greg had been outside the circle. Marianne had not been there to help her give birth.
It was all terribly wrong.
What if it wasn't all wrong? A voice at the back of her mind penetrated through the pain. What if this was how it was supposed to be? What if the vision was just one alternative future she had seen? What if this was right? What if this were the only way she and the baby would survive? Hope flooded through her. She grabbed onto the feeling with both hands. It was like nectar to a person dying of thirst in the desert.
But the feeling of hope dwindled with another contraction that made her feel as though her body was splitting in two.
Blood flooded the altar.
She's coming, the demon daddy whispered in her ear.
The shaman rattled a stick with feathers and beads at Greg. Raven intoned an incantation in what Marcie assumed was ancient Norse. Greg scowled with mild irritation at the shaman while Marianne told her to push.
I can see its head, Marianne shouted. Just another push, Marcie. You're doing well.
That's it. Push. Marcie's screams as she pushed were echoed by the wails of her newborn baby as she greeted the coven and the spirits that shimmered on the periphery of the circle. Marianne handed the baby to the shaman, who smeared oil on the baby's forehead. Marcie's baby squirmed under the man's calloused fingers.
Please, Marcie said. Let me hold her. Her plea went unheeded.
Raven and the coven chanted together. The baby screamed. The shaman rattled his staff and wafted a burning smudge stick made from dried basil, mint, angelica, fennel, and lavender around the baby. All the herbs were used for exorcisms and protection spells. They'd also been grown in Raven's herb garden. Greg was silent. He watched while Marcie's blood seeped into the altar stone. A smile crept across his face. Marcie was slowly bleeding to death, their child was about to be butchered, and the demon bastard was smiling.
If she'd had the strength, she would have climbed off the rock and throttled him. Please, Marcie begged. Stop hurting her.
Once again her plea went unheeded.
Raven, I swear to the goddess, if you don't let me hold my child I will fucking kill you when this is over.
Sweetie, you may not see it now, but when this is over you will thank me for all of this, Raven said while thrusting the squealing child up towards the sky and incanting something else in Norse.
You will hold our child soon, this I promise, Greg finally found his voice.
His smile widened.
Isn't she beautiful?
He stared at his child with fatherly pride.
I can't stop the bleeding, Marianne said, her head between Marcie's thighs. It's a blood sacrifice, the demon said. I'm sorry, my dear, but for our child to survive this, she needs your blood to flow and for these witches to burn.
He said it with a matter-of-fact tone of voice, as though her life was of no importance.
You have no need to worry, though.
You will not die. We need you to live a while longer.
Our daughter needs a mother.
Raven brought the baby back down, and the shaman rattled his rod at her again, and tapped her on the forehead with his calloused finger. He was sent flying across the circle, and landed on top of Hazel. The baby gurgled, and Greg smiled. Raven stopped chanting.
The circle was broken.
The ghostly specters gathered outside the ring floated towards the center, where Raven stood clutching the wriggling baby. Spirits circled Raven and the now giggling baby. They grabbed at Raven's arms and face. Bleeding cuts and slashes appeared on Raven's cheeks and stomach. Raven's screams were similar to those of Marcie's while she'd given birth. The women of the coven stood staring helplessly at their high priestess. Hazel wriggled out from under the naked shaman, but once she found her feet, was unable to move. They were all frozen by fear and confusion.
Silly little witches, Gregorathan said with a condescending air. Did you really think this would work?
Should I be amused or insulted? If I were amused I might let you live, but if I were insulted I would be angry. If I were angry, I would make an example of you as a warning to the rest of your ilk, and kill all of you except one to tell the story of what transpired here.
But who is to be the messenger? I think I'll let your gods decide that. The tiki torches exploded.
The oil that had been inside the lamps landed on the naked witch's bare skin and ignited.
Their screams joined those of Raven's as Greg collected his child from one of the spirits, who had wrestled her out of Raven's bloody arms. Here, the demon said as he placed the baby in Marcie's arms. Let her give you strength.
Marcie wasn't sure if he spoke to her or to their child. The baby's lips found Marcie's nipple and began to suckle. Marcie stared in shock as she watched her friends burn around her.
You're killing them, Marcie found her voice. Her tongue felt thick and her mouth was dry.
She'd lost too much blood and could feel her consciousness drift away.
I am only doing to them what they would do to us. This is self-defense. Nothing more.
And our daughter needs their sacrifice to become strong. He picked her up and carried her out of the circle. A trail of ghosts flocked behind them as they walked away. Flames lit up the sky as the farmhouse and the witches burned. Their screams followed them as they stole Raven's Land Rover. 12. Sunshine winked at her through the gap in the curtains.
A child's laughter drifted through the apartment.
If it weren't for the pain, Marcie felt it would have been easy to think that the previous night's occurrence had all been a bad dream. A little girl of about 3, dressed in a floral sundress, stood in the bedroom doorway staring at her. Auburn curls framed a cherubic face.
The child ran towards her on chubby baby legs and climbed onto the bed.
The white sheets were bloodstained. Thankfully she'd stopped bleeding sometime during the night.
Her daughter snuggled up to her.
Marcie breathed in the scent of her. She smelled like her father, the ocean and wild untamed places. Her giggle as she snuggled up was the most perfect sound Marcie had ever heard.
As she wrapped her arms around her daughter, Marcie felt an overwhelming sense that she would do anything to keep her safe. She'd never felt anything like it. Was this how her mother had felt when she was a baby? Was this a mother's love? Mama! Her daughter sighed into Marcie's neck as she draped a fat baby leg over her mother's hip.
Greg stood in the doorway, looking down at them. He'd found clothes somewhere along the line. He wore a pair of stonewashed blue Levi's and a plain black t-shirt. His feet were bare.
We should name her, Marcie said while stroking the baby's curls. Yes.
Do you have a name you would like to call her?
I was thinking about calling her Bridget. You are naming her for the Celtic goddess, I assume. Yes, Bridget was a strong warrior goddess who protected all who called upon her. I think our child will need that. It is a good name, Greg nodded and crossed his arms.
Come, Bridget, let your mother rest, and you have much to learn about the ways of these humans. Bridget wriggled out of her mother's arms off the bed and ran to her father on shaky legs. Greg picked her up and swung her around like any human father would do. Bridget giggled like any normal child would who felt loved and safe in her father's arms. Marcie listened as Greg read to their daughter. He read to her from Marcie's collection of Grimm's fairy tales. It was the same book her mother had read to her from when she was a child. The first story he read was Hansel and Gretel.
Do you see, child, he said when he was finished reading it. These humans, even when they are small like you are now, are wily and will lull you into a false sense of security.
They will let you think that you have won. It is when you feel safe that they will try to kill you. Do you understand this lesson?
Yes, Papa.
Bridget's baby voice was earnest in her reply.
What are you doing?
Marcie asked as she stumbled out of bed. The pain ebbed and flowed with each step she took.
I am teaching our child what she needs to survive in this world. But she doesn't need to grow up thinking that everybody is out to kill her. She needs to go to school and play with other children. But she is not like other children, and even your own friends would have killed her when she was too weak to defend herself. I will not allow that to happen again.
He pulled their daughter closer and began reading the Pied Piper of Hamelin. 13. The ghosts came at night. Their whispered tales were part of Bridget's education. Marcie and the coven had learned through bitter experience that the spirits, in general, didn't always tell the truth.
They had their own agenda.
She'd never known what to believe when they communicated through Sandra or when she used her pendulum. And now Marcie couldn't help but wonder whose agenda was being served with her daughter's strange lessons. Were they serving their own plan or Gregorathan's, or was there something else pulling the strings? Bridget grew every day. She was only 2 days old, but looked like a 5-year-old with the intellect of someone much older. She absorbed knowledge from every possible avenue. She watched Discovery, History, and crime channels, and even the odd Disney movie. Her father read to her from the magical texts on Marcie's bookshelves, as well as fiction and non-fiction books. Bridget devoured them all in her thirst for knowledge. Bridget was Greg's focus.
Marcie was pretty much ignored.
She'd spent most of the last 2 days in bed, resting. Greg would bring her food and water with jugs of rehydrate for her to drink throughout the day. He took care of her, but his ministrations were a chore he had to perform.
There was no love or concern in his actions.
She'd given him what he wanted, a child. She wondered what would happen to her now that she'd performed her task. Would she be discarded like an old toothbrush?
Her strength slowly returned.
She could now walk to the bathroom on her own. In between her lessons, Bridget would cozy up to her mother. Marcie always felt stronger when her child lay nestled up against her. Bridget gave off a beautiful warm glow that left Marcie feeling contented and a little stronger each time. Greg barely touched her. His promises of love had all been empty. There was a part of her that missed having him in her bed, a part of her that wished it hadn't all been a lie to get what he wanted. In that way, he'd been like every other man who'd ever disappointed her. While Marcie lay in bed, the ghosts drifted in and out of the flat. They gathered around Bridget in reverence. It unnerved Marcie. She wanted to keep her daughter away from the supernatural world. She wanted Bridget to have a normal childhood, but she wasn't a normal child. Greg had been right on that score. No matter how hard she tried to ignore that little nugget, Bridget didn't really belong with other children. She had a foot in both worlds. She was half human, half demon.
Her daughter's future scared her.
She only hoped that she would be able to help Bridget navigate the treacherous waters that lay ahead, that she wouldn't make the same mistakes that Marcie had, that her daughter would display better judgment than she had. Marcie's job at the hospital was in jeopardy. She'd missed a couple of shifts and didn't have a doctor's note. There'd been a voice message on her cell phone, letting her know that she would face disciplinary action if she didn't report for duty within 24 hours. She wasn't strong enough to walk to her apartment door, let alone drive to work. Then there was the question of explaining why she couldn't come to work. She didn't know how to tell her boss that she'd just given birth, or that the pregnancy had only lasted a matter of days. How was she to explain the gestation period for a demon? What rational explanation could she come up with for any of what had happened to her? How would she explain her daughter's fast growth? Bridget giggled at something the spirit of a little girl of about 6 said. Greg had found Marcie's collection of stuffed toys from her own childhood in her cupboard, and given them to Bridget, who played with them with her ghost playmates.
"This is Dr. Greg Roth," Marcie heard Greg say to someone on the phone. "Marcie is unable to come to work.
She has a severe case of gastroenteritis. If you check your fax machine, you will see that I have already faxed through my doctor's note.
She has been booked off for the rest of the week."
There was a pause as Greg listened to whoever was on the other end.
"Thank you very much."
He'd sounded so professional and in charge, just like a real doctor. He put the phone down and grinned at Bridget.
"No one will disturb us for another week." "How did you do that?"
Marcie asked.
"Do what?" "Fax them a doctor's note." "I don't have a fax machine." "And where did you find a doctor to sign it in the first place?"
He just smiled in answer, leaving Marcie to wonder if there was anything he couldn't do. 14. The knock she'd been dreading came on the third morning. Bridget lay on the bed next to her, reading aloud to Marcie, from Queen of the Pharisees' Children by Barbara Willard.
Marcie had read it when she was about 12.
Bridget had grown again overnight, and looked to be about 6 or 7.
Her curls were down to her waist.
Gregorathan was in the lounge conferring with the ghosts when the knock came. Greg opened the door to find 2 police officers standing outside. They each had a hand resting on their holsters.
Their stance was aggressive. "We're looking for a Ms. Marcie Grove," the young constable asked. "That's me," Marcie said as she stumbled with some help from Bridget out of the bedroom. "You should be resting," Greg said. "I've rested enough," Marcie said, and then turned to the 2 cops. "What can I do for you?" "May we come in?"
the middle-aged and overweight captain asked. No offense, but considering the reports about off-duty cops going around and forcing their way into people's homes and then robbing them blind, and in some cases raping women, I'd rather you didn't, Marcie said. The constable looked down at his feet, and then glanced sideways at his older partner, waiting to see how he would react.
"The press has been blowing those reports out of proportion."
"The police are not criminals. We are trying to do our jobs under difficult circumstances," the captain said.
"I am sure you are correct, but may I see some sort of identification?"
Greg asked, barring the entrance. The 2 policemen brandished their identity cards.
"So,
Captain Shabalala, what can we do for you?" Greg asked, reading from the captain's card. "Do you know a woman by the name of Hermine van Rensburg?"
"I'm sorry, but who the hell is that?"
Marcie asked, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. She couldn't help but hope that they weren't there to ask her about Raven.
"You may have known her as Raven Love," Captain Shabalala consulted his notebook.
With that, all hope dwindled.
"Yes, I know Raven. I didn't know she changed her name, though. Is she all right?"
Marcie's heart pounded in her ears. She only hoped the cops couldn't hear it.
"There was a fire on her property on Monday night. There were many casualties."
Unfortunately, when there are deaths involved, We have to investigate, in case it was arson and therefore culpable homicide, the captain said.
There was also a lot of blood at the scene, and it appears to have been some sort of ritual that went wrong, the constable interjected, eager to be a part of the interrogation. Your name came up during our investigation, and we need to ask you some questions.
The captain scowled at the constable and shook his head.
I don't understand. Why would my name have come up during your investigation?
I wasn't there on Monday night.
I was here with my family. As you can see, I'm not well.
I can barely climb out of my bed.
How would I have been able to light a fire on Raven's farm? It's just that one of the neighbors mentioned seeing you there. Well, that's not possible, not only since I wasn't there, but it's also impossible to see anything from the neighboring farms.
I would suggest you have a chat with the men on the farm across the road. They've been trying to get Raven to sell to them for years.
They've threatened her in the past. I think they may be running a carjacking ring. Then there's Ms. Van Rensburg's own testimony.
The captain ignored her attempt to divert his attention, and instead eyed Marcie, looking for any kind of involuntary reaction to his statement about Raven.
Is Raven okay?
Marcie asked, trying to avoid any possible traps.
She's badly burned and appears to have been mauled by wild animals.
The constable tried to get into the conversation again.
She's been drifting in and out of consciousness.
When she is awake, she screams your name.
I don't suppose you would know why she'd do that.
The captain's eyes locked on Marcie's, waiting for her to flinch.
There is no accounting for what people do when they are in pain, Greg interjected. As my wife told you, she was not there. She was here being sick.
I am greatly relieved that she was not with her friends, considering what has happened to them.
If you do not have any other questions, my wife needs her rest. We don't have any more questions at this time, but we may have some as our investigation progresses, the captain said. We'll be here, Marcie said as she visibly tried not to throw up.
Greg closed the door on the policemen as Marcie stumbled to the bathroom.
She didn't ask about the rest of her friends.
The constable's voice drifted in through the open window as the two cops walked away.
They heard the captain hushing his young sidekick. Now what?
Marcie asked after she'd flushed the toilet and they were sure the cops were out of earshot.
The police have no evidence to put you at the scene. What about my blood on the altar? The fire destroyed your DNA. How can you be so sure? I know all and see all.
15. Burned and gnarled hands grabbed at her. Nails dug into her skin. The smell of burning flesh wafted from the pyre as bits of ash danced on the wind. Marcie woke up gagging.
Her heart raced and she struggled to get her breath back. It was just another dream, she tried to tell herself.
The nightmares were the consequence of her guilty conscience.
Her friends were dead because of her, and there was nothing she could do about it.
They died horrible deaths. Being burnt to death was for Marcie the absolute worst way to leave this world.
But was there a good way to go, she wondered.
Her grandmother had merely decided that she was tired, went to lie down for a nap, and never woke up. Marcie had always hoped she would die like that, but she doubted she would have a peaceful exit with the way things were going. The only question was, who would hurry her demise? Would it be Greg and Bridget? Or would Raven and the coven come back from their fiery pit for revenge? She wouldn't blame them if they did. Bridget stared at her from the gloom of the dark bedroom at dawn.
She'd grown again.
Only her hair seemed to stay the same length at her waist. She'd lost her baby fat and looked to be about 10. She was a beautiful little girl, and the hints of the woman she would become were starting to appear. She felt sorry for the male population, they didn't stand a chance. Marcie only hoped that Bridget wouldn't be cruel. A smirk played at the corners of Bridget's bow-shaped mouth.
Morning, Mother. Bridget's voice had deepened and lost its high-pitched baby tone. You're looking better.
Father says you'll be able to travel in a few days.
Travel?
Where are we going?
Father says we'll be safer up north, where things are wilder, and people will ask fewer questions. How far north? Across the border.
Mozambique to begin with. I've been studying the atlas. We can travel to many countries where they have too many of their own troubles to notice us. Or they have superstitions about our kind, and will worship us as gods. It'll be fun, Mother.
Her daughter had a strange idea of fun, Marcie decided.
She felt Gregorathan's presence and turned her head to find him lurking once more in the doorway. He always seemed to be lurking in doorways. Perhaps it was because he had one foot in this world and one in another world.
He was a doorway.
She wasn't sure where that insight into his nature came from, but it seemed to make a strange sort of sense. He strutted towards her and placed his hands on her stomach, which no longer displayed signs of her pregnancy.
You are almost ready.
Your body has healed quickly, he said, staring through her. It was almost as though he could see through her skin and muscles to her bones.
We have until the new moon to find a home and another coven.
We will need their sacrifice to make a brother for Bridget.
What the fuck are you talking about?
Marcie tried to rise, but Gregorathan held her down. Bridget will need a consort, and we must make her one, he said it matter-of-factly, like making a demon baby was as ordinary as baking a cake.
I will not, Marcie screamed in his face. Please, Mother, Bridget stood next to her father. I beg you, do this for me. Don't you want me to be safe and protected?
To be happy.
Of course I want you to be safe and happy. It's what every mother wants for her child. I know Father has disappointed you, but he does love you and would never do anything to hurt you.
You must know that. He would do anything to keep us both safe, and we need another warrior like Father to help us.
Please say you understand.
Marcie simply nodded.
And being with Father is not such a hardship, is it? Is he not the perfect lover? He is, but... Marcie's thoughts were fuzzy, and she had difficulty formulating any sort of objections to what her daughter was saying.
She knew she had to say no, but couldn't quite say the word. She was powerless to deny her daughter anything. Thank you, Mother, Bridget said, kissed her on the forehead and smiled at her father.
It was a victory smile. Marcie was theirs to do with as they pleased, and there was nothing Marcie or anybody could do to stop them.
16.
There was something in the room with Marcie.
She'd gotten accustomed to the tingling at the nape of her neck, and she no longer had heart palpitations from the constant comings and goings of the spirits, but this was different. Greg had taken Bridget out to the movies at Brooklyn Mall for the 7 o'clock show. He felt that they both needed to get acquainted with humans and their customs, which included dinner and a movie and some father-daughter time. Bridget had been reading The Hobbit, and wanted to see the final part on the big screen like any other child. The normality of that had given Marcie hope for their future. Hope was fleeting, but it was something she enjoyed wherever she could. The ghosts had also gone, leaving her utterly alone for the first time since the day of Bridget's birth.
But that had been over an hour ago, and she was no longer on her own.
She'd known on instinct that the spirits that came to see Bridget meant her no harm, but she couldn't say the same about whatever was with her now. She switched the lamp on next to the bed, almost knocking over her glass of water.
The heart palpitations that had always accompanied an otherworldly visit were back, as were the tingles at the nape of her neck. A hunched-over figure scuttled out of the light, away from the bed and into the corner of the room.
Something else moved deeper in the bowels of the flat.
What do you want?
Her voice was hoarse.
Nerves had thickened her tongue, turning her mouth dry.
The figure turned around. She wore a hospital gown. Bandages covered parts of her body but were starting to unravel. Her once long black hair had been singed to the scalp, and her face, where it wasn't burned, had deep lacerations, almost as though an animal had torn her face to shreds.
Her arms and hands were severely burnt.
Her fingers had been reduced to claws, flesh and tendons burnt away. Raven's once luscious lips had been burnt off, and she now snarled at Marcie. Drool dribbled from her ruined mouth down her fleshless chin. A scream froze in Marcie's throat as fear got a stranglehold on her.
You did this to me, Raven mumbled as more of her saliva ran down her chin. I'm sorry, Marcie choked the words out. Her breath came in gasps. A heavy weight sat on her chest, forcing her down into her pillows and made it difficult to breathe. I didn't want any of this. Can't let you make any more, Raven wheezed. Must I? No, Marcie screamed.
With the little strength she had, she pushed back against the invisible force holding her down.
Her will to live drove her on.
She kicked and scratched. The blanket covering her fell away. Raven stumbled forward as Marcie grabbed the lamp and swung it. The light hit nothing but the air where Raven's head should have been. The ghosts of the dead coven members came to Raven's aid and flew at Marcie, driving her back onto the bed. They forced the air out of her lungs. She struggled to breathe as they pressed down on her chest. Stars speckled her vision as her struggles became feeble. Her vision blurred. The lamp fell from her hand and rolled away. The front door burst open as Bridget and Greg stormed in, followed by the other spirits. The dead witches fled. Only Raven's spectre kept her talons firmly wrapped around Marcie's throat.
I told you we would be too late, Bridget scolded her father. We are not late, she still lives, Greg said as he pulled Raven off of Marcie.
Marcie gasped for air while Raven howled in frustration as she disappeared.
I thought you knew all and saw all, Marcie said between gasps. I do, Greg said as he picked up the lamp and put it back on the bedside table. Then how the hell did you not see this coming? I did see this coming. What the hell do you mean you saw this coming?
Marcie's anger flourished now that the threat of death was gone.
You needed to face your sister witches to understand that your survival depends on staying with us.
They want you dead, and only Bridget and I can keep you alive.
This is why we need to make a brother for Bridget.
There is safety in numbers. Do you understand? Marcie nodded. Her anger receded as tears and emotions welled. The women she'd loved like sisters, the women she'd trusted with all her secrets, were dead and wanted her to die as well.
She wasn't ready to die.
She wanted to live, even if that life was one of a virtual captive.
It was still better than the alternative.
17. Mozart tinkled through the speakers while Bridget, who now looked to be 13, slept in the front passenger seat. Marcie curled up on the back seat, watching Greg drive Raven's Land Rover. Greg had somehow managed to change the number plates after their escape from the farm, and hidden it from view. They'd left Pretoria at 4 that morning, and drove towards the Mozambican border. She'd given up trying to figure out how he did the things he did, or how he knew all the things he knew. Being a supernatural being certainly had its perks. It was a very different sort of drive to the last one she'd had in Raven's car. She was far more relaxed, and at least this time she wasn't about to give birth or bleeding to death. Giving birth again would come soon enough.
The drive through the mountains and valleys of Pongola had been stunning.
She'd always loved the trip to the East Coast. Some of the most beautiful scenery in southern Africa could be found there. They reached the border post at Cozy Bay in time for lunch. Greg jumped out of the car and went inside the border control building to fill out their forms. He had 3 South African passports for them, all of which were perfect forgeries, the best magic could make. According to the passports, they were officially a family. Marcie was no longer Marcie Grove, but Mrs. Gregory Roth. It was a 20-minute drive from Cozy Bay to Ponta do Ouro, their new home for the next few weeks or until they needed to go further north. Greg pulled up behind a log house, nestled into the hill above the beach. It was a 4-bedroom, 4.5-bath, luxury home with a nautical theme. The interior had been designed by someone with very little imagination. It had been made to look like your stereotypical beach cottage, with antique green glass shark net buoys still in their nets decorating the corners of the main living room area. An intricate wooden model ship took pride of place in the dining room display cabinet. Shells in bottles decorated every conceivable surface area. Mirrors seemed to be on every wall. Marcie had managed to avoid looking at her reflection, but it was now unavoidable.
Her hair was streaked with grey, and she looked almost 50.
She'd aged 20 years since giving birth to Bridget. How many years would having another child take from her?
There is a coven close by, Greg said after they'd unpacked and settled into their new home.
They stood on the wraparound deck, surveying their view of the beach and ocean.
I can sense them.
They're a mix of African and Western witches, practicing a watered-down blend of hoodoo and Wicca.
They shouldn't prove to be much of a challenge.
They've forgotten most of what they should have learnt about our kind from their ancestors.
They'll sense that there is something special about Bridget.
Their curiosity will make them welcome her with open arms, and when they see you, their soft hearts will want to make you whole once more, he said to Marcie.
And hopefully they will have the good sense to fear me.
We have a few days to seek them out. You need your rest and Bridget needs those days to grow stronger. He sipped his wine and watched the waves drawing strength from them.
Our time is coming.
18. As the moon traveled across the sky, Gregorathan made his plans.
Less than a week until the new moon, and time was running out.
He'd waited as long as he could.
Marcie was still weak, but there wasn't much he could do about that.
She was no longer the vital woman who had summoned him, and it was doubtful that she'd be able to deliver a healthy son this time around, but it had to be her.
Marcie was the one who'd summoned him, and he was tied to her.
Why couldn't it have been a stronger, younger, more powerful witch who opened the door for him? He wanted to throw the wine glass across the room in frustration, but instead, he put the glass down and made his way to Marcie, who was as usual sleeping. He would have to wake her, as he had on that first night. Looking down on her, desire was the last thing he felt. Disappointment was the overriding emotion coursing through him. She'd given him life and then given him a beautiful, strong, powerful daughter, but now that the final goal was within easy reach, she was falling apart. He knew he had to be gentle, but he wanted to take his frustration out on her. He wanted to be rough and just fuck her hard, but as much as he would enjoy it, it wouldn't solve the problem. He parted the mosquito net and climbed under the cotton sheet. The mattress was firm and barely gave under his weight. She groaned in her sleep and rolled away from him. The unconscious rejection of his advances irked him. The temptation to force himself on her tugged once more, but he ran his fingertips along her naked thigh. She'd missed his touch, he knew that. It wouldn't take much, and she'd be begging him for it. Marcie moaned again, and her legs parted enough for his fingers to slip inside her. Her lips parted for a kiss. He breathed some of his life force into her, to give her the strength she would need, but it weakened him. With the new energy, Marcie woke. She rolled over and onto Gregorathan.
It was her turn to take control.
She guided him inside her and rode him hard and fast. She took her pleasure with the desperation of someone whose life depended on it. Tears ran down her cheeks and her fists pounded his chest with each pelvic thrust. He rolled her over onto her back and shot his seed into her. There was no love between them, but as he looked down at Marcie, her chest heaving, he was grateful to her. She'd been generous and brave. He knew that she would do what was necessary for their survival.
There was not much more he could ask of her.
He kissed her and she drank his kiss as though she were dying of thirst.
She had been starved of affection.
He had been cruel and promised himself he would do better the second time around. She needed his touch and love to give him a mighty son, and for that reason, he would give her all the tenderness she needed, even if it irritated him. It would not be a waste of energy, if it helped his unborn son be as strong as his sister. He allowed Marcie to snuggle up to him, and wrapped his arms around her.
She fell asleep as quickly as she had woken.
Her breath tickled his neck as his mind traveled to the next obstacle. The coven was close by, and Bridget was making inroads with them. He watched them from a distance. His daughter was aware of his presence at their gathering. He watched his daughter smile and beguile the witches while Marcie slept, and his son started to grow inside her. 19. Bridget smiled and nodded at the clueless witches, dressed in black robes, gathered around her on the deserted beach. They were not a full coven, but they would serve the purpose she and her father had in mind. Finding a full coven these days was a difficult task.
They had been lucky with the first one.
The moon was not visible to the human eye, but Bridget could see the thin sliver in the sky. It was what most people would call a moonless dark night, but she could always feel its presence. She had been conceived on the full moon. Her brother and consort would be born on the last night of the new moon. He would be the yang to her yin. She only hoped her mother would be strong enough to make her brother as powerful as she needed him to be. She had no use for a weak consort.
"What time your family will come?"
Maria, the high priestess, asked with a thick Portuguese accent.
"They're on their way."
"They will be here on time." "Don't worry," Bridget said. She was no longer a child, but a fully grown woman who commanded attention and respect. These women would do her bidding, and not ask a single question. Silly witches, as her father had said of another coven the night she was born. "Here they come," she said as she watched her highly pregnant mother waddle towards them. She stumbled on the sand, and her father had to help her up and half carry her the rest of the way.
"Your mother is no longer young," Maria stated. Her father looked drained.
He'd been using his life force to keep her mother alive over the last couple of days. He should have allowed Bridget to give Marcie some of her life force, but he'd said that they needed Bridget at full strength during the ritual.
That only one of them could be at half their strength. "Hello, Mother," Bridget said, giving her a hug and placing a kiss on her cheek. "Father."
Her voice warmed up a few degrees when she greeted Gregorathan and embraced him. There was a flicker of jealousy in Marcie's eyes. She wished she could love her mother more, but she hated weakness, and her mother was weak in every possible way.
There was no point getting attached to her when she wouldn't live much longer.
The path from the main beach took them through a narrow passage between the rocks.
Torches lit the way ahead.
Like any good predator, Bridget had perfect night vision, as did her father, but the witches and her mother did not. By the time they made it to the cove, that was only accessible when the tide was out, there were many stubbed toes and grazes. The small circle of witches formed around Marcie, Gregorathan and Maria, who would perform a midwife's duties. The ocean and the creatures of the night were silent for the birth of her brother. Maria and the rest of her coven didn't have much to do or say, they were merely there as witnesses and to give their energy to the baby. Gregorathan held Marcie's hand as she screamed and groaned.
He was coming. 20.
Marcie stared up at the dark sky as another contraction ripped through her. She lay on a picnic blanket on the beach. It was a lot more comfortable than the stone altar. After Bridget's birth, she'd known what to expect and had prepared for the pain.
But for some reason this birth seemed easier.
Maybe it was that Greg had given her some of his energy to get through it, or it was that her son was just more natural than Bridget had been.
Or maybe it was because this coven wasn't trying to kill her unborn child, they were there to help.
She wondered if they knew just how much they would have to do to help.
But she guessed, Bridget had probably left that part out.
Blood and amniotic fluid seeped into the blanket and sand beneath it. The silence around her was eerie and only punctured by her own screams. There weren't any chants this time around, or a shaman jumping around and rattling a stick at her.
"The baby, it is coming." Maria's voice was a few octaves higher with excitement. "I can see the head."
"You push now." Marcie pushed and screamed. Greg squeezed her hand and said something unintelligible. She felt the baby squeeze its way out of her womb, and as he left her body, all that she was, all her dreams for the future, everything she once hoped to be, went with him. Stars sparkled around the periphery of her vision. Her son greeted the world with a gurgle, and the witches replied with shocked screams. Bridget walked to the center of the circle, and took her brother out of Maria's burning arms. Greg looked down at Marcie and smiled. "Thank you for giving me life and for my 2 children. You shall be remembered," he said, and kissed her numb lips as her life force began to drift away.
"May I hold my son?" Marcie asked.
Bridget placed her brother on her mother's chest while the witches screamed and burned around them.
He squirmed and gurgled and blinked at her.
His eyes were sea green, and he had a mop of black hair. He was his father's son.
"I'd like to name him Gabriel if that's okay with you," Marcie said, staring into her son's green eyes. "It's a good name," Greg said. "Named for the left hand of the Christian god." "I can live with it," Bridget said as she took Gabriel from her mother's arms.
As Marcie's vision faded and she slipped into unconsciousness, the coven's screams faded, and all she smelt was their burning flesh. The last thing she saw was Greg and Bridget walk away with Gabriel, her son who would never know his mother.
21.
Gregorathan sat at the end of the hotel bar watching his children. They were perfect. Beautiful, sleek and deadly.
Their prey found them irresistible.
They'd had to leave Mozambique behind after the coven burned, and found their way to Nairobi, Kenya. The SAA crew were staying at the hotel. One of the pilots chatted up Bridget, while Gabriel smiled at one of the air hostesses. They were easy marks. Bridget laughed at the pilot's joke and flipped her hair. The pilot whispered something in her ear. She smiled, nodded and took him by the hand. She led him up to his room, to his death.
It was as good a way to go out as any.
What man wouldn't want to die in the arms of a beautiful woman? Although he'd probably prefer it to be later in life and not in his prime, and certainly not tonight, but Bridget needed his life force.
It would look like he'd died of a heart attack.
Natural causes were a lot easier to explain, and it meant they could stay in one place a little longer. Gabriel was dark where his sister was fair. He had his father's black hair and green eyes.
He touched the air hostess's arm.
The poor girl closed her eyes and shivered in anticipation.
She was practically salivating.
She would survive the night, but find herself pregnant by morning. Gregorathan sipped his whiskey and thought of Marcie. His children no longer needed him. He taught them everything they needed to know, and they had each other. They would roam the world together for a few hundred years before they got bored with each other. It was time for him to find another witch and breed more children. With a smile he paid the bar tab and winked at the waitress.
He had a flight to London in the morning.
About the author. Joan de la Haye writes dark and twisted thrillers featuring dangerous women, cold-blooded assassins, and survivors who turn the tables violently. Her stories push boundaries and revel in the kind of justice that doesn't play by the rules. Her characters don't wait for permission, they take control, exact revenge, and refuse to be victims. If you enjoy thrillers with bite, grit, and unapologetically fierce heroines, you've just found your new favorite author. Visit her digital lair at www.joandelahaye.com.